all the indicators are much sounder than America's at the moment. And again, I said to someone, if they ever do build a maple curtain on the 49th parallel, it will be to keep the Americans out because of societal collapse south of the border. But that's the problem, is that if Iceland collapses, if Greece collapses, most of the rest of us who aren't Icelandic or Greek can get along. When the United States goes belly up, it's going to drag down Canada and Britain and Australia and Western Europe with it, and that is the threat.
We'll talk more about that threat after the break. I'm Ezra Levant, talking with Mark Steyn, author of After America. It's a hell of a book. See you in a minute. Welcome back to The Source, our exclusive show-long interview with Mark Steyn. Mark, in your book, After America, it's so meaty you can't even skim it. There's things on every page, but there's some major themes that stick out. One is America doesn't really build things anymore. It doesn't really do things. A lot of paper shuffling around, lots of credit card borrowing, and you make the case that it's just not sustainable. What do you think about this debt default discussion in Washington these days? Well,
it's not the default. I mean, this is what's insane about the last month's meaningless mumbo-jumbo. It's the debt ceiling question. The issue isn't the ceiling, it's the debt.
Yeah.
When you've got $15 trillion of debt, and again, that's why the situation the United States is in is not the same as Canada or Portugal or Greece, but simply because of the huge numbers. People can do all these comparisons, you know, debt to GDP ratio and debt per capita, but actually the hard dollar sum, $15 trillion, American government spending assumes that the rest of the planet will be willing to sink 20% of its entire GDP into US Treasury debt, effectively indefinitely. The rest of the planet isn't going to do that. It's not just that the government of the United States is outspending America, it's outspending the planet. And you made the point with Canada and Europe that after the Second World War, America basically absolved the rest of the West from responsibility for its own defense. So it sucked up. In effect, American taxpayers pay for the German healthcare system, because by absolving Germany of the need to have an army, Germany can spend that money on healthcare, and it still isn't enough. It still isn't enough. So I think we're looking at, and I think that goes for Canada too. Canada has a small, a brilliantly skilled and incredibly brave armed forces. When you think of the Princess Patricia's snipers that the Pentagon wanted to give the Silver Star to in the Afghan campaign, and the Chrétien government sort of mothballed it because they didn't want it getting out that the Canadian military still killed people. Well, they do, and brilliantly. But they're a small elite military, and you know and I know that the reality is that continental defense, the first line of continental defense, is the US military. If the US turns into a large Portugal, what do you think that's going to do for continental defense?
You know, I came across a statistic the other day that every bit of gold ever mined in the history of man, it's 20 meter by 20 meter block, it's worth only about $7 trillion, $8 trillion, and which is about as much as Obama is going to rack up the debt in about another year's time. I mean, he spent. And it's not just him, though. No. It's and let me say, in your book, you quote Dennis Prager, who says the problem isn't Obama. Obama didn't just declare himself president. What kind of a country voted for him, and did they buy a pig in a poke? Were they buying something else? Are Americans, if an election were held today, I see polls all the time, maybe a generic Republican would beat him. I'm skeptical. Do you think Obama would be elected again today now that people know what he's like?
Well, generic Republican is always the perfect.
That's my favorite Republican.
Yeah, generic Republican. But the minute generic Republican gets the nomination, generic Republican turns into Sarah Palin. The media jump on them, and the media demonize them. And again, I think this is the U.S. election campaign is going to be the most bloody and brutal in American history. I mean, I think it's going to be incredibly vicious, because I think of the investment that the media have in an essentially fraudulent figure. This man who ran on these absurd bumper sticker platitudes about hope
Hallmark
and change.
candy. He was reading Hallmark cards.
Yeah, exactly. All this sort of generic abstract nouns, the generic gaseous uplift, audacity of hope, and all the rest of it. These are tough times. I mean, these are really tough times. I mean, we are jeopardizing the future of the civilization that built the modern world. The IMF says that China will be the dominant economic power by 2016. In other words, we are coming to the end of a 2-century period of Anglophone dominance. Canada is the perfect illustration of this. Canada, for most of its history, was oriented toward London. As Britain's power faded after the Second World War, Canada began to think, well, it matters more to get a favorable hearing in Washington than it does in London. So Canada but that's like the merest tweak. You're going from one Anglophone power to its prodigal son. That's the smoothest transition of global dominance in world history. To think it's going to go that way round when China becomes the dominant economic power is cloud cuckoo land stuff.
Well, and that's the thing. If America, I mean, I don't know if America is going to collapse in a cloud of dust, but we can see it slowing down. Unemployment is sticking above 9%. That's European. You know, growth is low. The military strength is just atrophying. So it's more whimpering. But avoid as being nature abhors a vacuum. What will fill that vacuum? Will we be seeing a Chinese aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf? Will Russia take liberties? Will we see nuclear powers pop up around Arabia? What will the world look like if America continues its decline?
Well, I think you will see Chinese carriers in the Persian Gulf. I mean, it's fascinating to me. America is an anomaly. It's a non-imperial superpower. An historical anomaly. So if you look, and I mentioned earlier that Britannia's lion cubs had reoriented themselves toward Washington in recent years. But there's a whole other story there, that if you look at the way the Chinese are building ports in Burma, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, these are all outposts of Britain's Indian Empire. The Chinese, they've swallowed up resources in Africa. As you well know, they're big investors in all kinds of resource companies in your province of Alberta. They bought a ton of bauxite in Jamaica. They're establishing the global network they need. You mentioned the Russians and the Saudis and all the others. I think the danger we face is not the replacement of the American world order with a Chinese world order, but it's a world without order, where the Chinese and the Russians and the new caliphate emerging from the Middle East gobble up what they can, and Western power retreats to a sort of few citadels, beleaguered citadels, that it defends as best it can.
It's terrifying. I read the book, and I'm an optimistic guy. I'm finding it hard to stay optimistic. Folks, we're talking to Mark Steyn, author of After America. Oh, it's hilarious, but it's also terrifying. We're going to talk more with Mark after the break. Welcome back. We're talking with our favorite author, columnist, troublemaker, and human rights criminal, just like me, by the way, Mark Steyn, who joins us from our Montreal temporary studio. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure, Ezra.
Listen, I want to shift gears, I mean, to something that I'm still trying to figure out. I'm talking about Anders Breivik, this mass murderer. I think I'd call him a terrorist. I read his 1,500-page manifesto. At first I was calling him crazy, but I don't think he's so much crazy, it's just evil. What are your thoughts on that and the media response to it?
Well, you know, I think he is evil, and I think it is an act of terror. He wanted to strike at the governing party of Norway, and we are obliged to regard that, I think, as an act of terrorism. He killed innocent civilians in large numbers. He's an evil man. He is a terrorist. He issued a large manifesto that has obsessed a lot of the, particularly in Canada, a lot of the commentary, not so much in Norway itself, interestingly enough, where the rather lethargic police response is weighing more heavily on their minds. He issued this manifesto that I'm cited in there, so is certain other people who've written on the present state of Europe, but so is Thomas Jefferson, Mahatma Gandhi, Winston Churchill. If you're going to start censoring everyone who's mentioned in that report, it's going to be a very long list. Mark Twain, Hans Christian Andersen. I'm not even the most eminent Canadian cited in there. Naomi Klein, he's That's a right. Naomi Klein reader, which I've never managed to do. What's more interesting to me is to say, accept everything that the critics say, let's say that's correct, that somehow reading all these people, reading Mark Steyn and Naomi Klein and Mahatma Gandhi and Charles Darwin drove him to do this. If so, what then? What do you want to do? Do you want to censor? Do you want to censor that? Do you want the state to control people's access to that? I think Europe is in the state it's in because it has too narrow a public discourse. I wrote a big cover story for Maclean's a couple of years ago that our pal Paul Wells criticized, in which I talked about the resurgence of neo-nationalism and fascism in Europe, which is partly a response to the insane, crazy, control-freak state, the Human Rights Commission mentality, trying to say, no, this is the level of polite conversation, and if you talk within these boundaries, you can be admitted to the party and you can have tea and cakes and sit around with the nice people. But if you want to raise other subjects, you're going to be pushed out and you're going to have to look elsewhere. Well, people are looking elsewhere.
You know what, I think they're pushing out an increasingly large fraction of society. I mean, they tried to criminalize Geert Wilders,
right,
who leads the third largest party in Holland.
Exactly.
And most of the people they push out are going to be normal guys who'll just grumble about it. Well, but once in a while, I think you're going to push people out, and instead of having a safety valve of expression, they might turn to violence.
No, I think that's true. I mean, I love this phrase extremist. I mean, the phrase right-wing now actually is just applied basically by organizations like the CBC and the BBC in Britain and Le Monde in France, is just basically applied to anyone who doesn't quite fit into categories that they don't understand. So Ayaan Hirsi Ali, for example, is now put with the right-wing cranks, even though she's a black feminist. You know, all a black feminist has to do to get lumped in with the right-wing crazies is just, you know, just move off the reservation ever so slightly. Geert Wilders, his whole thing is he wants to save the gay moment in Amsterdam. Amsterdam's undergoing an epidemic of gay bashing. You know, imagine if we're in Montreal, it's got Le Village Gay here. I don't know whether have you spent time in the gay village?
Not enough, I guess.
You're secure enough in your sexuality.
Sure, we'll hang out afterwards.
They have in the summer, they've got like the cute little gay village cops in their like little buttock-hugging tight shorts, strolling arm in arm. Imagine if there was an epidemic of gay bashing in the gay village in Montreal. That's what's happening in Amsterdam. In other words,
those would all be right-wing gays if they complain about being
exactly,
beat up.
exactly. And that's the same with Geert Wilders. He wants to, you know, and as you say, he's the third largest political party in the Netherlands. If you look at the polls, how can you be? By the way, and I'd love. If anyone from the CBC or the BBC or those kinds of guys are watching this, I'd love an explanation on that. How can you be a so-called fringe extremist but command more support than the mainstream? Doesn't that actually suggest that the complacent BBC, CBC twit is in fact looking at it only through the blinkers of his own perspective?
You know what, I use a phrase, I didn't coin it, others have, the media party. I put it to you and to everyone that the most powerful party in Canada and the United States is not the Republicans or Democrats or conservative liberals, but the media, which shapes your outside or your inside. You're too far, you're free. And I think the CBC is increasingly the most active underminer of our country. I don't say that just because I work for a competitor. I said that long before I joined the Sun. What do you think moving into an era, I mean, I see clashing forces. On the one hand, technology makes it harder than ever to censor, harder than ever to stop an idea. On the other hand, we have this impulse from governments and the Jennifer Lynch's in the world to censor. Who's going to win that fight, and what should happen to an organization like the CBC?
Well, you see, I think that's very interesting. I think this is actually about control now. I think this is why people like Commissar Lynch of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, these people are panting for control of the internet, because they actually, it's critical of them to preserve their role as the gatekeepers who frame the discussion. What has happened in Europe, for example, I think I think, for example, you know, one of the biggest stories in post-war Europe is the demographic transformation of Europe. I don't see why you should not be able to discuss that. And I think if the